Hi and welcome to the Mike's DIY Tips channel on YouTube. I'm Mike, and in this video I'd like to show you how to adjust a door that's come out of alignment and is binding on the frame or catching on the floor, or maybe its lock or handles don't work properly. To get the door working properly again, there are several things you need to consider. My advice is to consider the hinges first, because adjusting the hinges might be just enough to avoid having to plane the edge of the door, which then means you have to recoat with paint or varnish. The trick is to do just enough work to get the door back into working order again, and then if you choose you can go further and do a bit more work in order to set the door perfectly in the frame. I'm using this mock-up of a door and frame to talk about the ideal door setup, what can go wrong and how to overcome the problem. First of all, the ideal door gap, the door clearance so that the door does not hit the frame. We can go for something like 2 to 3 millimeters. So there's a 10p coin, thickness about just less than 2 millimeters, or the new pound coin, which is about 3 millimeters. Anything less than the 2 millimeters, you're in danger of the door binding on the frame if there's any settlement in the building and movement of the frame, and particularly with an external door which is subject to weather throughout the year. And certainly stick to the 3 millimeter gap with an external door, because don't forget, you're not only allowing clearance for the door to expand in the damp weather, but also for future coats of paint or varnish around the edges. Here's another mock-up. This time it gives us a much closer look at the frame. What you see here is the cross-section of the frame if it was cut through with a saw, and here's a piece of door hinged onto it. And there's the 3 millimeter gap that we've been talking about. But there's another gap I want to talk about. If I turn this round, can you see that there's a slight gap down there as well? That's the gap between the door stop, which is part of the frame, and the door face itself. That's important because otherwise, if it's too close, the edge of the door here will bind on the frame. And that can happen sometimes due to poor workmanship when the door and frame are installed, but more likely because the frame or the door has slightly distorted. And you overcome that by moving the hinge slightly outwards in that direction, and I'll show you how to do that later on. Now I want to talk about positioning of the hinge. If you notice, there isn't much of the hinge sticking out there. The projection there is half of the overall knuckle. That's the knuckle from there to there. So about half of the knuckle sticking out. And that's alright for small hinges. This is a 75 millimeter or 3-inch hinge. But if you've got more robust hinges with a much bigger knuckle, then it's more usual to have the whole knuckle sticking out. The gap that we talked about, that 3 millimeter gap, is achieved by sinking the wings of the hinge into the edge of the door and into the edge of the frame in such a way that you're left with about a 2 or 3 millimeter gap between the door and the frame. Now, this is the outside of the frame, and it's quite normal to have some architrave or trim effect around the edge of the frame, around the door. But when you open the door, the trim stops the door opening flat against the frame like that. And the thicker this trim, the more the door is prevented from opening flat. If it's a problem, then you need projection hinges which stick right out, like that one, and that's a more ornamental variation of that. For my first demonstration, I want to show you how to move the hinge sideways. First, we need to remove the hinge, and as you can see, the screws are a bit painted up, so I use a pointed bradawl to get the paint out. If you have a really troublesome screw, another tip is to use, if you've got Phillips head screws, use a Phillips head screwdriver bit and give it a few sharp taps with the hammer. That will not only help to dislodge the paint, but it will dislodge the screw thread if it's been there a long time and possibly rusted up. So now, with the hinge taken off, you can see the 3 screw holes in the wood, and we need to create 3 new screw holes slightly to the side of the existing ones in order to move the hinge over. Now, the first method, if we're only moving the holes a little bit, I take a chisel end bradawl, or you could use an electrical screwdriver with a very thin small end, and we push the bradawl to the right hand side of the hole because we want to move to the right. So if I just position that there and push it in, what is happening is this tool now is moving some of the vertical wood fibres into the space created by the previous hole, and now we've got a new place to insert a screw. So now I've screwed the hinge back in place just using that one new screw hole, and already you can see I've moved it across by approximately 1.5 to 2 millimeters. And then you can do the same for the other 2 holes, and for that hinge the job's done if that movement is sufficient. But if you want more movement across, you can use the same technique to create a screw hole further over. But let's suppose that the screw holes have been messed about so much they're too loose and sloppy for the screw. I'll now show you an alternative. What we're going to do instead is to use a little wooden peg, very crudely made, and drive it into the existing screw hole to fill up the hole. Ideally, it's best to put a little bit of glue on before you drive it in. So put it in the middle hole there, drive it in with a hammer. If it won't go all the way in, you drive it in as far as possible and then chop it off with a chisel, like this. So now we've got a fresh start, and we can make the hole wherever we want it in order to put the screws in. Get yourself a piece of scrap wood with a nice straight grain. Put a mark representing the length of the proposed peg that you're going to make. Do a saw cut down there, and then take a handy knife and position it on the wood about 3 to 4 millimeters in from the end. Tap with the hammer, and that neatly splits off a piece of wood like that. Then, using the same technique again, you put the knife on the piece of wood, and because we haven't got much wood, we don't need much pressure, so I'm just bearing down while wriggling it, and that cuts off a neat piece like that. Use your knife to take off the corners. We're only doing this very crudely. Now what we need is a point on the end. Not a sharp point, but just a taper, because that's the end we're going to drive into the screw hole that we want to fill up. Now, the sort of thing that can go wrong with a door set in the frame, the door can be too far over on the hinge side so that it's really tight on the frame, especially if it's had a redecorate and some more coats of paint have been put on. So the answer there is to push the door over by putting packing underneath the hinges. If it's only the top that's binding, then you only need to pack out the top hinge. And don't forget, if you've got a third hinge midway, as you probably have on an external door, if you're going to pack out the top, whatever packing you use there, you need half the thickness there because this is only halfway up. If on the other hand the door is binding on this side, in other words the leading opening edge, then you might need to sink the hinges further into the frame and further into the door edge in order to move the door across. If the problem is uniform right from top to bottom, you need to do both hinges, or if there's 3 hinges, do all 3. Otherwise, if it's just at the top or bottom, just do the hinge. That will help the door to move across. Here's a door lying out on the floor. I've taken it off its hinges on the door frame, but now I want to take off the hinge on the door. But the screws are all painted up. And these are slot head screws, so I'm using a pointed bradawl to work the paint out of the groove. So now I've got the screws out and I need to just cut through the paint. Otherwise, when we remove the hinge, it's likely to split away the wood. So now I've cut some packing, cut it so that it goes into the hinge recess easily. You don't want to be struggling to push that in. And I'm using new screws because the old ones are all painted up. It's much easier to use new ones. Now then, at this stage, put the door back in the frame and check the door action. If it's okay, then you can put the other 2 screws in. If you have a problem with the lock edge of the door catching on the frame, if you need to plane down the middle part of the door where the lock is, then you've got a big problem because the lock's in the way. You've got to take the lock out to plane the door, then you've got to reset the lock further in, which means resetting the handle positions. So it's much easier to plane down this edge of the door in order to get even clearance in the frame, and then if necessary reset the hinges in the edge of the door or the frame. So now we want to sink the hinge further into the edge of the door, in which case we've got to remove a thin layer of wood. Nice sharp chisel. First of all, go round and cut down at the perimeter. Now next, and this is quite important to understand, we're going to knock the chisel in at an angle like that, and we want to go down about 1 millimetre or whatever measurement you want to sink the hinge in by. But we just need to do a consistent cut into the wood like that about every 5 or 6 millimetres. The weight of the hit with the hammer must be the same each time so that the chisel cuts down the same amount. And then what we can do is just knock it with our other hand and all those little bits of wood come out. Be very careful when hitting the chisel at this point here, because if you hit very hard, that can come right off. We don't want that. Use the hinge edge to check that you've got a nice level cut. Make any adjustments that you think are necessary. And the job's done, and you can put that hinge back. If the door is tilted like this in the frame and it's just catching there and the gap here is about right, then you might have to plane the edge of the door. And if it's the upper part of the door, then you can plane it with the door in situ. and the same if the door is catching on the head just there. You can just get on some steps and plane the top of the door without taking it off its hinges. However, if you need to plane down this bottom edge of the door, then you're going to have to take the door off in order to plane it all the way down to the bottom. With these problems, you always do the work on the door, not on the frame. Now I want to talk about clearance at the bottom edge of the door. Obviously the edge must clear whatever you've got laid on the floor. In particular, if it's got carpet and the door is dragging on the carpet, it can cause quite a lot of strain on the hinges, and if it's really bad, you can actually split the wood on the edge of the door, as the following picture shows. We want to plane the edge of this door all the way down. It's a little bit tight on the frame, but first let me show you how I'm holding it in place. This is a traditional carpenter's source door with a V-cut in the end intended for sawing wood, but also it's ideal to support a door and stop it falling over. Alternatively, I like to sit astride so that it's me that's holding the door up, and I find it very effective when I work on my own. Of course, if you're not used to this sort of thing, it'd be much better if you had an assistant. Now, I want to demonstrate just planing off a little bit of the door. I've put a pencil line just at the side, indicating that I want to take off about 1.5 millimeters. But I only want to do it from here to here, which means that starting from here, we're taking nothing off, going as far as here, which is 1.5 millimeters. So the way to do it is to start at that end and work your way down. Because every time the pane passes over, it's taking off a shaving. That's why we start there, because that's where we want to take off the most wood. Now I want to demonstrate planing just a short length halfway down the door. If we want it to go from here to here, we're taking almost no wood off here, but we are taking more of a thickness there. So we start in the middle and we work further and further away from the middle. Same principle. Now if you want to make that really hollow to suit the frame, you'll get to a point where, because the plane is straight, the cutting blade will be lifted off the door. So what you do, you turn the plane slightly sideways like this. Just working to the point that you will have marked with a pencil. Then when you've done several planing strokes, always check it for square. If you need to correct, because you've got a slope that way or that way, you can alter this lever here. So if I move the lever to the right, it cuts more on the left and vice versa. So you can use that to correct if you've gone off the 90 degrees. Then we carry on planing to do the rest of the length of the door. Another important thing to tell you, when you finish planing, this edge, it's like a razor, it's very sharp. So run your plane along like that at an angle and just take off the sharpness. Then finish off with a bit of fine sandpaper. When planing the bottom or top edge of the door, there's one or two things to tell you about. If it's a hollow door, it's only got a skeleton frame, and often there are hidden metal fasteners in this corner here. There, and the same at the other end. If you're going to cut down with a saw, you may hit one of these fasteners, in which case just use a hacksaw to get cut through the fastener and then continue the cut with your wood saw. If you're planing a door with a wood grain coming down the door like that, Be careful not to use the plane like this to flick off the veneer. Instead, angle the plane this way on that edge, and on this edge, angle the plane like that. Nice steady strokes, and of course you do need a sharp plane. Here's another tip: when you finish planing the door and you've put a coat of paint on, I always use the quick drying acrylic undercoat primer and then help it to dry with a hairdryer. If it's a water-based paint, it will dry very quickly with the influence of the warm air, and then you can get another coat on before you have to put your top coat on. And if the painting is on the hinge side, I would suggest, before you put your last coat on, hang the door back in the frame and then paint down the edge of the door, because then the wet paint is out of the way because it's on the hinge side while it dries. In older buildings, it's possible for there to be some slight building settlement, only 1 or 2 millimetres, but it can be enough to distort a frame and disturb the lock striker plate, where the latch should go into there nice and comfortably and the lock chute should go into there. If the door sags downwards like that, if something's gone wrong between the relationship of the frame and the door, you might find that the latch chute like that doesn't go into this plate here, which is mounted in the door frame. This part here could be catching on this edge and not going into the slot, or if the door has sunk, it could be catching on this cross piece here, in which case you've got to file it down, take out this plate and file the aperture in order to get it lined up with the door lock. As you can see here, when I pull the door closed, it doesn't latch until I give it a tug like that. The way around that is to either take off the plate and move it over so that you're repositioning the screw holes. Alternatively, and this is probably better and easier, is to take off the plate and just file a bit of the metal on that edge there. So we'll grip it with some pliers like that, or better still some locking grips like that so that it won't slip out easily. I'm going to use a nice fine textured file which will give me good control. So that's the edge we're filing, and I'm using a solid surface like this little step stool. Nice steady strokes, and don't keep the file in one place because then you'll get a step down, so keep moving it this way and that way as you do the filing strokes. It's a matter of judgment how much you keep on filing before you put this plate back on the door frame to try the door again. I suggest you file a little and try, file a little and try, rather than guess and then end up filing off too much so that when the door closes it actually rattles. I've turned the door over so that we can have a look at the handle. Now if a handle's not fitted correctly, it can be quite stiff to turn and be very irritating. So here's a loose pair of handles, and I've drawn a line on the door at 90 degrees because I want to show you something. There's a little bit of movement there, as you can see, and if when you mount the handles the spindle is not at 90 degrees across the door, it slopes. This handle is mounted on the door lower than that one, and it can cause stiffness in operation. Another problem I've come across is where the square spindle that goes from the handle through the door, through the lock, into the other handle, whereby the spindle itself is too long. It only needs to be 1 millimetre too long and it can cause a lot of problems. When the face plates are screwed to the door, if the spindle's too long, it's pushing hard on that handle and hard on this one, making it very hard to turn the handle. So the trick is to cut a bit off the length of the square spindle with a little hacksaw. Now here's a problem. The handle goes on the door, but it doesn't quite lie flat. And the reason is this circular piece of metal here is touching the door before the rest of the plate. So we need a recess in the door to accommodate that protrusion. So I'm going to demonstrate how to deal with that using this piece of plywood. There's the hole that the spindle goes through the lock, and at the moment the handle rocks on the surface. So with a sharp chisel, start at the top in the middle and go round like that. Start at the bottom and go round like that, and all the time I'm going, I'm twisting the chisel and just pushing gently. Just a gentle push all the time. And then we do the same the other side, starting at the bottom in the middle and working our way up so far and down the other way like that. You're never going to get a perfect result. It doesn't matter because it's going to be covered up. So I hope that's given you a good rundown on how to adjust a walk-through door and make it work properly. I've done videos on planing wood and sharpening blades, and the icons for those are coming up now if you'd like to click and watch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon.